Hello geographers, and welcome to this video on managing tectonic hazards. What we're going to be doing today is look at how we can reduce the effect of tectonic hazards, whether that is social, economic or environmental impact. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at this from the aspect of the 3 Ps. So here we've got some icons that you will see through the process of watching this video, which refer to, first of all, prediction. And I think monitoring is important to include, even though it doesn't start with P, because monitoring is how we are able to predict tectonic hazards, despite this icon suggesting it's a crystal ball method. The second one is looking at protection, so how we can make our buildings and infrastructure more life safe to ensure that it's not the thing that is killing people or causing the damage. And the last one is planning, so making sure that communities are ready to jump into action if they should need to during the event of a tectonic hazard. So the first thing we're going to look at is prediction and monitoring. So with this example, we are actually going to be looking at volcanoes and earthquakes. If we only focus on earthquakes, which is what we're going to be doing for the other 2 Ps, then actually we wouldn't really have enough to talk about for a reason I'll explain a little bit later. So we are able to draw upon volcanic events here as we think about how we can monitor and predict volcanic eruptions. So what I'd like you to do is just pause this video and find video clip number 1 in the description box. As you're watching this, I'd like you to be making notes in the first column of your table on lesson 6 within your booklet. So you should have one that says monitoring and prediction at the top. I would make sure you're only taking up half of the space here because we are going to be talking about earthquakes after you've watched and we've run through this volcanic example. So pause now and then come back to me once you're ready to reflect on your findings. Okay, so let's go through some of the things that were mentioned within that video. The first one is earthquakes. Now, as I am recording this in March 2021, we have actually had some news over the last couple of days that this is actually happening in Iceland at the moment. There are lots of earthquakes going off in the peninsula where the capital city is, and they think that a volcanic eruption is imminent. So this happens, you get these earthquakes because the magma is having to crack through the volcano to get to the surface. So these earthquakes can be a really telltale sign something's going to happen. And they're measured using seismometers that used to be a little pin on a bit of paper that wiggles if the ground moves. But nowadays they're very digital. We've got one in the spine at Thomas Hardy if you haven't seen it yet. So the next time we're back in school and walking past that, then do have a little look. The second thing is ground temperature increasing. So we measure this using infrared sensors, often on the ground or maybe looking at infrared cameras on satellites. And what that will tell us is as the ground is heating up, then of course magma is getting closer to the surface. We know that magma is thousands of degrees Celsius, so of course it's going to have an impact upon the temperature of the rock around it as it moves closer to that crater. The third thing is increases in gas emissions. So when a volcano erupts, due to the fact there is magma escaping, along with that magma, you will get lots of different gases. And the one that is the most noticeable before an eruption is sulfur dioxide. If anybody knows what sulfur dioxide smells like, you can also sometimes smell it before an eruption does happen because it's got a very potent, eggy smell. But these measurements obviously don't just rely on people's noses. There'll be people taking gas samples from the fumaroles around the volcano before it does erupt, and often constantly measuring those. So any kind of increase in normal levels is going to suggest an eruption is imminent. And then we've also got ground deformation, which is the bulging of the ground just before that magma makes its way through the surface. So magma will tend to pool in an area as it starts to build up pressure that will then eventually enable it to break through the flank or the side of the volcano. So as you saw in that video, Mount St. Helens had a very famous ground deformation shape where it actually started to bulge on the side and erupted out of the side rather than through the original top crater. So it can be really informative in actually telling us where the eruption is actually going to happen. The eruptions that have been happening in Etna, again, have actually been creating these new, or has created a new crater. So it's very important that we monitor the shape of the volcano so we know where it's going to erupt, because these things can be quite big. Okay, so you're now going to do the same for me, but you're going to now think about earthquakes. So like I said, it's quite difficult to predict earthquakes and work out when they're going to happen, but new science and new technologies are discovering that there may be some warning signs that we're still in the very early phases of understanding. So I'd like you to pause this video now and again watch the second video clip in the description box, keeping into that first column on your notes, so monitoring and prediction still. You might just want another little subtitle that says earthquakes. Watch the video, come back to me, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's have a think about earthquake prediction and monitoring. So it's worth noting that anything we're just about to talk about is actually quite new in understanding seismic waves and earthquakes. So historically, cultures have had to depend upon some rather strange ways of predicting these earthquakes. Rather famously, in China, they have previously looked at snakes and the way that snakes react just before an earthquake. There is a particular one who will find itself bashing its head against walls just before earthquakes occur. Whether animals are able to pick up on something that we're not able to has not actually been proven, but culturally and historically that has been something we've used, alongside obviously those unscientific theories that you saw in the video. But we're not going to focus on those today, and I would recommend that you don't really discuss them in too much depth, because we now think that there are other things that can help us with our predictions. So one thing that's really important is understanding where earthquakes are going to be the worst. Now, a lot of that will depend upon the geology, upon the rock type and the soil in the area. So if you've got a rock type or a soil that is quite liquid-like, maybe it's got quite a lot of water in it, so a clay or anything that's quite unconsolidated. So, I'm not talking really big bits of granite or basalt, those really hard resistant rocks. If you've got something that's quite weak, then that will actually potentially cause a different sort of damage to the harder, more resistant rock areas. So it's really important to map out your geology to predict which places are going to be affected in which way. Another thing that we're recently starting to understand, I say recently in terms of the last few decades, is we are starting to work out that earthquakes tend to happen on a bit of a cycle. So if you haven't had an earthquake for a particular set of years or decades, then it could be that soon enough you are going to get one, because these earthquakes do seem to be following that cycle. We also think as well that distribution and mapping where other earthquakes have been before might help us. So as you can see on this slide here, we have got a tectonic boundary that actually goes across Turkey. And you can see that if you look at the dates on it, those earthquake events have almost kind of happened in order from east to west, almost moving towards the west of that map towards Istanbul. And we actually know that, we have had recent earthquakes in the western parts of Turkey since this diagram was even created. So we think that sometimes there can almost be a bit of an unzipping along a plate margin, and that can sometimes help us predict where the next earthquake will happen, even if it's not going to tell us when. We also think that with some earthquakes, as the ground is starting to kind of snag and build up pressure, that you can sometimes get tiny shifts in the ground itself. So using those seismometers to look for these pre-shocks, they're called. You might have heard of aftershocks, which are often after the big earthquake itself, but pre-shocks are generally harder to spot. But if you've got the right kit, then sometimes you can spot some which may be suggesting another bigger earthquake is about to happen. And the last and most recent study is that we think as earthquakes earthquakes are beginning to happen and as tectonic plates are moving, the cracks that begin to be formed before the big earthquake can actually let gases escape from the mantle. So we've noticed in recent earthquakes that there has been an increase in emissions of radon and thoron, and that would suggest that you are starting to get quicker and bigger movements within the plates themselves. This is a very new theory. We don't have radon and thoron monitors globally around the planet at the moment, but it could be in the next couple of decades we realise that this is a very important part of earthquake prediction. Okay, so we're now going to have a little bit of think about protection. You've hopefully noted from everything we've spoken about so far that we can't actually accurately predict volcanic eruptions in terms of exactly when they're going to happen, or earthquakes indeed, when or where they're going to happen. So we need to make sure that the areas in which we live are not going to cause more damage on top of the shaking associated with earthquakes. And we are going to focus on earthquakes today because there's much more to be said about earthquake proofing buildings than making them volcanic eruption safe. So we're going to be looking at life safe buildings from an earthquake perception. So what I'd like you to do is pause this video clip now, and you're going to watch the third clip that's put in the description box below whilst you're filling out the central part of your worksheet today. Now you'll notice that there is a diagram in the middle of that worksheet, and I would recommend that you maybe annotate around that as much as you possibly can whilst you're watching. But obviously if something comes up that doesn't seem to fit this diagram, then there is space below it as well. So make some notes, have a watch, and then come back to me when you're ready to go through it together. Okay, so the first thing to note is how important regulations and rules are. None of this is actually really going to happen unless you have got rules in which people have to follow. And one of the reasons for that is that what we're just about to talk about is really expensive. So a lot of people will try and avoid doing it, particularly if they're not going to be living in the house or building themselves. So it's really important that regulations are there to ensure that these buildings are made to be life safe in seismic areas. Now, the most obvious thing you can do is make your building stronger so that it doesn't collapse. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. In that video, it mentioned reinforcing concrete with steel, so you can have steel casing around lots of parts of your building structure. You can have cross bracing, which you can see in this diagram. You see those almost kind of cross shapes in the actual design of the skyscraper in that diagram. And what that does is it actually stops the building from swaying and pancaking, which is an actual real term used to refer to earthquakes making buildings collapse like a pile of pancakes. So that's really, really important in a lot of places as well. Another thing you can do is make your building flexible. So instead of trying to withstand the force of the seismic waves, to work out ways in which your building can almost sway with it. And what that's going to do is it's going to, again, stop that breaking, because it's not going to create a stress or a fracture between the movement and the building itself. So there's lots of things you can do here. First of all, you can make sure that you have got quite flexible materials in your building. So some people use rubber as a foundation, so that the building almost absorbs the shock before it even gets to the main part where the people are. You can also get base isolators, so they can sometimes be almost like huge ball bearings that the building will sway upon. Something else you can do is you can counteract. So instead of being flexible, you can counteract the actual movement of the seismic waves, which again allows for that swaying a little bit. So one thing you can do is you can put computer controlled weights on the top of the roof that will work electronically to work out which way they need to kind of sway to make sure that they're counteracting those seismic waves. You can get these big pendulums. So this is a very famous example of a pendulum you can see on my slide here, that is in the Taipei 101 building. And what that does is it basically swings in the opposite direction whenever that building is affected by an earthquake, again reducing the stress between the building and the ground. And the last thing that you can do, which is a very new theory, but was mentioned in that video, is you can shield your buildings. So the example you saw in that video showed a diagram where there was almost a circular shield, so that when the earthquake reaches that area, the shield is hit by the seismic waves and it almost deflects those energies away from the building. So obviously you can only do that if you've got the space to put those really big shields underground, but it is something that new developments are considering if there is the money and space to allow it. Okay, so we're now going to finish by looking at the final thing. And this is actually probably, although the cheapest, going to be the most important thing you can do to get ready for a tectonic hazard. And again, we're going to be looking at earthquakes in particular, because you can link this to your Nepalese case study from a few lessons ago. So what I would like you to do now is I'd like you to pause and watch video clip 4, looking at the Red Cross and how they are supporting communities in Nepal to get ready and plan for future earthquakes, and then come back to me once you're ready to go through some of those points together after you've made a few notes in your final right hand side column of your worksheet. Okay, so what did we come up with? So hopefully you've just written somewhere that this is obviously Nepal and it's the Red Cross working on the things we're about to discuss. The first thing they showed you was lots of education. You saw people giving lectures in schools, and actually the aim often is to educate the children so that they go back and educate their families. There will be some adult education, but a lot of belief is that if you start young, it will filter through the generations. Another thing that is quite unusual, but seems to be quite effective in Nepal, is TV actors and street plays. So one of the problems in really low income parts of the world, such as Nepal, is that a lot of people, if you put a leaflet or a poster up somewhere into a community, a lot of people wouldn't be able to read it. So we have to think about how we get over language barriers and literacy barriers to ensure that everybody has a chance to get themselves prepared. So acting out street plays, using famous actors to draw people to those street plays, all of those sorts of things are going to help to show people what they need to do if they are unable to read what they need to do. Another thing as well that I've definitely discussed with my students as we've been looking at Nepal is how often earthquakes can provide an opportunity to build back better. So there's no point building back the exact same building that was collapsed due to the earthquake, because it's likely another earthquake will happen. So another thing that the Red Cross are doing are educating builders and developers to show them how they can relatively cheaply improve buildings to ensure that they don't collapse. They probably won't be able to afford a lot of the things we've mentioned in the protection bit. A lot of this is just education about if you put a rod there, if you put a rod there, if you lay the foundations like this, is not necessarily causing a much greater kind of budget to be needed, but it is education for builders that is allowing them to understand how to build back better. Another thing you saw in that video was the Community Action for Disaster Response, and they were training people in how to respond effectively, because as they said in the video, the people in the community will be the first there, of course, and they're the ones that are going to make those first few minutes after an earthquake really matter. So training them in things like search and rescue, how to complete first aid, how to firefight, because ruptured gas mains are a very common factor associated with earthquakes that can set off quite significant fires in an area. So making sure these people know what to do, and actually that helps reduce the panic in an area. So naturally, if people have got a plan, they're going to reduce all of those impacts simply by panicking less, because they know what to do and they've been prepared for it. And the last thing they mentioned was go bags. And go bags are a thing in every single hazard that we look at in this topic, where having a bag full of stuff that you can literally grab and take with you if you're suddenly exposed to one of these hazards is really important. And in this video, you saw that they were including lots of necessities like blankets, food like rice and noodles, batteries, torches, anything that people are going to need to help get them through the first day, couple of days, maybe even a week after that earthquake, if they're unable to go back to their property to find their own belongings. So what I thought we'd do, just to test your understanding of everything we've looked at in this lesson, is I'd like you to go to the back of your hazards book or find just a bit of paper somewhere you can scribble some answers on. And I'd like you to run through these questions and just see if you can work out the answers. Those people really trying to test their understanding here, it would be great if you could do this by having a closed book. So closing that booklet with all of those notes that you've made today and seeing how much of this is stuck within your mind. So I will give you a bit of time to do this, but of course you will need to pause as well. And then when you're ready to go through the answers, then you can unpause the video and I will run through those with you together afterwards. Okay, so let's run through these one by one. So question number 1, what are the 3 Ps? You should hopefully, in any order, have prediction, preparation and protection. Remembering we also refer to monitoring when we think about prediction, but to keep it nice and simple, we look at those 3 Ps. What's used to measure earthquakes before a volcanic eruption? Hopefully you came up with a seismometer as an answer to that. Question number 3, what changes can satellites pick up before an eruption? Now, there's lots of things that you could have come up with here, but satellites are mostly used to look at ground deformation, so changes in the ground, bulges, whatever. Or they can also be looking at surface temperatures if they've got infrared cameras loaded on board. So anything like that would have got you 1 mark. Question number 4, which gases do we think may be emitted before earthquakes, giving up to a week's warning? Bearing in mind, of course, as I said, we don't have a lot of detectors globally to look out for these, but it would be radon and thoron. Number 5, name one way in which we can make buildings stronger to prevent earthquake damage. So there's lots of things, and again, you may have even picked up on things from that little diagram that is in your booklet as well, but anything like steel casing in cement work, rods within brickwork, cross bracing that we spoke about, anything like that that makes the building stronger would have got you a mark. Question number 6, what will you find in the middle of Taipei 101 to counteract seismic waves? That was that big yellow dampener pendulum that's going to effectively swing the opposite way to the rest of the region as it reacts to an earthquake. Question number 7, what material is used in foundations to make buildings more flexible? Now this question asks for material, so what I was looking for was rubber, but if you put anything such as base isolators or the solid shields, any of those would be fine as well, because of course you would still be able to refer to those in an exam style question. Number 8, name one thing that might be packed into a go bag. So anything necessary, to be honest, you could have got a mark for, but the things we mentioned and were mentioned in the video, blankets, rice, noodles, anything like that. Question number 9, how do the Red Cross overcome language and reading barriers when educating communities? And of course, that's then putting on those street plays. And the last thing is name one thing a member of a community is trained to do in the event of an earthquake as part of the cadre training. So with that, the main things we spoke about were first aid, search and rescue, and firefighting. So hopefully just running through that quiz will give you a little bit of a pointer as to what you remembered, what you need to go back and reflect on. But I do hope that you're now in a position where you've got a full grid with lots of information about all the ways in which we can reduce the impact of our tectonic hazards.